All right, in this video, we're going to wrap up our discussion of Chapter 5 of Objectivism, the Philosophy of Ayn Rand and Reason by talking about polemics, and especially mysticism versus skepticism as denials of reason. Stay tuned. Okay, to this point in OPAR, we have skipped the sections on polemics, where Dr. Peikoff is attacking or contrasting the objectivist view with other important views in the history of philosophy. And I wanted to now tackle polemics, and so in this section it's mysticism versus skepticism, but I think it's a good opportunity to circle back to some of the other ideas. And I want to start out by just asking a more general question, which is, what is the value of polemics? And the primary value, I think, is not to refute bad views, but to gain clarity on correct views. And the basic point is that to really grasp what Ayn Rand is saying, you need to see it in contrast to alternatives. And so being able to get, okay, what is the alternative view of metaphysics that what are alternative views of metaphysics? What are alternative views of the nature of knowledge? What are alternative views of the right method of acquiring and validating knowledge? And I think the clearer you get on these, the clearer you get on what Ayn Rand is saying. And one reason why that's important is because it's very easy to slip into some of these views ourselves. In Leonard Peikoff's course, Understanding Objectivism, he goes into the ways in which Intrinsicism and Subjectivism, and then Rationalism and Empiricism they're very tempting. And one way you can see the objectivist view of objectivity is as it's recognizing what's good in the other views. So if you just take Intrinsicism versus Subjectivism, in Intrinsicism, it's a concern with reality. We got to get reality the way it really is. And Objectivism agrees with that 100%. And then it's with Subjectivism, it's that no, the consciousness has an identity, is a certain kind of process. And Objectivism agrees with that too, and that you have to take into account the process and things associated with the nature of consciousness, like the fact that knowledge is contextual. And what Objectivism is saying is that, all right, let's get what's right about these views and reject what's wrong. And so you can see how, though, given that there's something right in each view, you can easily overtake the stuff that's not right, or at least it can seem that you're doing that. So for instance, I think a lot of the kind of debates within Objectivism, part of what makes them difficult, I'm not saying this is the fundamental cause, but part of what makes them difficult sometimes to think about is that, yeah, it can look, is this person being principled or dogmatic? Is this person recognizing the contextual nature of principles, or are they being subjective? And those can be really hard assessments to make. And again, I'm not saying that, oh, it's just everybody's just misunderstanding the other and whatever. That's not my point. But my point is that it's precisely in that the wrong views have an element of the truth that makes them plausible, and that therefore we want to be really conscious of what those views are and not let any of the poison into our thinking. And so I think that's really the core of why it's important to really go into these polemical sections. And just as an aside, one of the interesting things about this book is Leonard has talked about, like, his view was to deliberately write a textbook, and that it wasn't aimed at being, eloquent, gripping reading. But one of the things that I think certainly I see is that some of his most eloquent writing in the book comes up in these polemical chapters, where he's able to get the way in which false views that seem diametrically opposed are really kind of two sides of the same false coin. And there's a lot of really beautiful observations, beautifully articulated. So let's start with some of that. All right, so I'm not going to give a full summary of each of these sections, but I do want to give a high-level view of what's covered. And so let's start with metaphysics. In metaphysics, we get two forms of rejecting the basic axioms. We get idealism and materialism. So idealism is the idea that there's two realities, a higher spiritual reality, and then we get materialism, the rejection of consciousness. And what Leonard argues is that With idealism, you have consciousness without existence. And then with materialism, it's existence without consciousness. And of course, from the objectivist view, there could be such a thing as existence with no consciousness. But insofar as we're talking about knowledge or a theory, it's the rejection. It's the idea. You basically have a theory about existence that rejects consciousness. Then, and this next point does the theory of concepts. We don't get its own polemical section, but I think it's important or valuable to bring in. We get that there's realism, and this is the kind of Platonic realism, or in a much better form, Aristotelian realism. And it's the idea that abstractions exist in the world apart from the human mind. And then we get nominalism that says, no, they absolutely don't. They're creations of the mind that don't reflect external facts. Then we have two views of what is knowledge, intrinsicism and subjectivism. And intrinsicism says that knowledge is a passive grasp of an external object, an object that exists apart from the mind. And then subjectivism is the view that no, it's that what consciousness, what knowledge is an active creation of consciousness. Then we get kind of two methods for acquiring and validating knowledge, and that is rationalism and empiricism. So the rationalist says up with reason, down with sense experience. And then the empiricist says down with reason and up with sense experience. It's that you have what we can count on, what we can rely on is that which we can observe, not that which is inferred from sense experience, or at least that is downplayed. And then finally, we get to two different views of reason, or the validity of reason. One says that we have a faculty higher than reason, more powerful than reason, and that's mysticism. It's an unerring automatic form of knowledge, and that's what gives us real knowledge, certainly about the most important issues in life. Or skepticism, which denies the efficacy of reason and says, no, we don't have anything superior to it, but in order to reach important truths, we would need that, because reason by itself can't allow us to reach important truths. And so then we could ask the question, well, how do these different views relate to one another? And in one sense, you could just line them up, in effect, in different columns and say, typically you'd get idealism leading to realism in theory of concepts, leading to intrinsicism, leading to rationalism, leading to mysticism, and on the other side, materialism leading to nominalism, leading to subjectivism, leading to empiricism, leading to skepticism. And there is kind of a general tendency for those views to come grouped together, but you definitely can't, particularly on the side of subjectivism, you'll find exceptions all over the place. So you can't just assume, well, I've got one piece of somebody's view and I can therefore predict every other element. So, for example, Leonard makes the point that Kant views himself, at least for most concepts, of having an Aristotelian view of universals, but that he's a subjectivist, and he's a subjectivist in a very major sense. Or you could take somebody like Marx, and so Marx obviously is a materialist, but you couldn't exactly classify him as a rationalist or an empiricist, and he's not a skeptic. He's what Ayn Rand called a neo-mystic. Or you could take somebody like Hobbes, and Hobbes is a materialist, a nominalist, a subjectivist, an empiricist, but you wouldn't call him a skeptic, or at least I think there's arguably elements of skepticism. But the point is that Leonard's not kind of presenting these are the two alternatives in the history of philosophy, and everybody falls on one side or the other, though there are reasons that these tend to go together in various ways. Though it's interesting to then think about, so Objectivism's view, and this is what Leonard covers in the epilogue, and Ayn Rand talks about it in many places, and it's really kind of an aspect of the theme of Leonard Peikoff's book, Ominous Parallels, which is that Objectivism views history as a duel between Plato and Aristotle. And so Plato is, he's the consistent, from idealism all the way to mysticism. And you think, well, Aristotle's the exponent of reason. Shouldn't it be kind of a three-way duel? What about the skeptic subjectivist side of the equation? And I think the issue is, from objectivism's perspective, subjectivism and skepticism are dead ends, that they can like knock things down and they arise to poke holes in bad arguments by the idealist, intrinsicist, mystical side and of the pro-reason side, but that by themselves, that they don't lead anywhere. They're not historically sustainable. And in fact, I think the most interesting or sophisticated perspective on this is the one that Leonard Peikoff outlines in his book, The Dim Hypothesis, where he gets, the kind of a view that rejects integration, which is going to be a subjectivist, skeptical view, that is unsustainable historically, and that it's always going to be some form of what he calls misintegration that is going to be sustained, or a proper view of integration. But that subjectivism and skepticism, these are disintegrating perspectives on human knowledge, and that human societies cannot live or tolerate for long that kind of situation. And so another way to think about it then is, because subjectivism and skepticism are dead ends, really helps us shed light on Kant's unique role in the history of philosophy. So that if we think, well, it's a duel between Plato and Aristotle, objectivism's view is that Kant is on the Platonic side. But notice how, if you read the epilogue to OPAR, and maybe you haven't yet, because I'm jumping way ahead to the end of the book, Leonard talks about exactly what his role is. And this is, I find, fascinating, because it's essentially he's safeguarding, or he's using subjectivism and skepticism to safeguard intrinsicism or mysticism. So this is how Leonard puts it. This is on page 456 to 457. In order to solve the problem of universals, Kant held, a new metaphysics and epistemology are required. The metaphysics identified in objectivist terms is the primacy of consciousness in its social variant. The epistemology is social subjectivism and its corollary skepticism. This approach left Kant free to declare as beyond challenge the essence of the intrinsicist ethics, duty, i.e. imperatives issued by nominal reality itself. Kant's Copernican revolution reaffirmed the fundamental ideas of Plato. And so from objectivism's perspective, the real issue in philosophy, if you want to boil it down, is reason versus mysticism. And you can see all of these other ideas as either philosophic attempts to buttress mysticism and provide it with a real basis, or as an attempt to, how would you put it, as an attempt to undermine reason and thereby directly or indirectly, deliberately or not deliberately, buttress and support mysticism. So in the end, it's reason versus mysticism, and that's kind of the perspective. And then we can see all of these polemical views as, are they as ways of knocking down the case for reason, and thereby leaving us with the only alternative, which is some form of mysticism. So even though I've just said that the issue, the fundamental issue in philosophy is mysticism versus reason, I do want to say a little bit about skepticism, because I think for some people, certainly for me, I was never tempted towards skepticism. I mean, even as a very young teenager, when I first encountered it, like there was something that just seemed really wrong about it. And I had this idea that no, reason should be able to lead us to knowledge. I mean, I can remember having that before I even encountered Ayn Rand, probably at the age of 14. And, but I had trouble answering skeptical arguments. And so I want to say a little bit about how objectivism thinks about skepticism. And one of the interesting things is how little Ayn Rand directly talks about skepticism. She says a few things about Hume, a few things directed directly at skeptical arguments, and but it's usually in passing, and she doesn't treat it as a major issue if you contrast that with how much she wrote about somebody like Kant. And I think it's the basic issues from objectivism's perspective. There's not really a special job of answering skeptics. The job is establishing knowledge. And And so from that perspective, it's not like, all right, now you got to trot out after that your 10 different arguments against skeptics. But that said, we do see the real answer to skeptics throughout OPAR so far. So remember, from Objectivism's perspective, there is no such question as, does man have knowledge? Can man reach knowledge? That by the time you get to the level of philosophizing, you have to know a lot of stuff. The question is, well, how do you separate the valid from the invalid? And so you can't, skepticism doesn't even get off the ground. But then if we look at in metaphysics, part of how objectivism is going to be able to sidestep the whole issue of skepticism is that because it insists on the primacy of existence and rejects the primacy of consciousness, and in particular, the prior certainty of consciousness, the idea that our starting point is, well, I know that I'm aware, or that I know that I'm conscious, but am I conscious of something? Am I conscious of the external world? We don't get trapped in kind of the Descartes problem of, all right, well, I have consciousness. Now, is the world real or something like that? It's no, first you're aware that existence exists. And it's only from grasping that you can then say, okay, all right, I'm conscious. So there's not even a foothold for skepticism to get involved there. Then it's, once we get to the senses, it's that objectivism insists both on the primacy of consciousness, but then that consciousness has identity, that in coming to aware, it has consciousness undergoes a process, and that's not grounds for dismissing consciousness. It is the precondition of consciousness. The precondition of being aware is to undergo a certain process, and that process, it contributes something. Consciousness has an identity that contributes something. And so that's where we get the answer to all the skeptical attacks, and including objectivism's insistence on the form-object distinction, that we're aware of objects in a certain form, but that it's aware of those objects. And it's also in the senses that we get that what we're aware of directly is the perceptual level. That's the given. We're directly aware of objects, and so that's going to answer a lot of Hume's kind of attacks. Hume, if you'll recall, we talked about, starts with, well, we have sensations, and how do we ever get to entity, and how do we ever get to causality, and that all of that is gone if what we're directly aware of is entities. Then at the level of epistemology proper, it's okay, so once you've established something by reason, rooted in sense perception, using the method of objectivity with reduction and integration, if somebody comes along then and says, well, maybe you made a mistake, that is arbitrary, and the arbitrary is out. Arbitrary doubt goes in the same category as arbitrary assertions, because it is an assertion. It's an assertion that maybe you've made an error, and you can't jump from the fact that man is capable of error to maybe you made an error in this particular case or in this particular argument. And so that your attitude towards a skeptic who says, well, maybe you're wrong, maybe you made a mistake, how do you know you exist? Maybe you're a brain in the vat and there's a scientist playing with a whole bunch of things. No, all of that goes in the same category as an Alex Jones conspiracy theorist who says, yeah, well, maybe, I don't even know what his conspiracy theories are, and if I did, I wouldn't want to regurgitate them here. But it's that there's absolutely, that's the kind of status that a skeptic deserves once you've established your knowledge all the way back to your foundations. And if you have a solid foundation and you've validated your knowledge, then there's no room for arbitrary doubt, just as there's no room for arbitrary belief, and therefore there is no room for skeptics. So in the last video, we talked about the way in which Galt's speech makes the life or death stakes of even the most abstract ideas in philosophy real. And in particular, we talked about the way in which Ayn Rand viewed evil ideas as, or she viewed these ideas as really trying to justify placing the I wish over the it is, which she regarded as the essence of evil. And as she put it in Philosophic Detection, she had a view that I think is important and profound, that evil systems of philosophy are systems of rationalization. And it's precisely that they're trying to rationalize putting the I wish over the it is. And in the worst form, what they're doing, the wish that they're trying to rationalize is the wish for power and the wish for destruction. But I think it can be a mistake to only see philosophy in those terms, or at least there can be a tendency to view bad ideas, the ideas that we're talking about in these polemical sections, as obviously wrong and obviously monstrous. And I don't think that that's right. I think if you really contend with them and see the logic behind them, that one thing you should get, if you really understand the ideas and the arguments offered for them, is their plausibility. And I think that that's rooted in the fact of, well, two facts. One is that the truth is really hard to conceptualize. Philosophic truths are really hard to fully identify and articulate. And that then the failures and the flaws in attempts to articulate them, including good ones like Aristotle's, then that makes plausible the counterattacks on them. And so, the plausibility of subjectivism is the flaws in intrinsicism, and the plausibility of intrinsicism is the flaws in subjectivism, or the weaknesses in subjectivism. And so I think it's to really get these polemical sections and have them stand in your mind as real knowledge, you want to see, well, what was it that made this plausible? And so I just want to take one example that I think is something that if you just hear on the face of it, it could sound crazy, but if you actually get what led the thinker to it, you can get its plausibility, and that is idealism. So idealism is the idea, recall, that there's two worlds. There's the higher spiritual world that's superior to this physical material world. And so that view is really first articulated by Plato. And if you'll recall, when we were going through Aristotle's induction of objectivity, one of the points we made is he was able to cash in on Plato's distinction of what we would put as percepts and concepts between, ideas and what we gain, the world that we see through our senses. And if you recall, what led Plato to this insight was recognizing how dramatically different these two phenomena are. So, with our ideas, it's they're abstract and mental. They're not physical. That they don't change versus the changing world around us. That they're singular versus they're stand for a multiplicity. He gets that there's all of these. One's known by reason. One's known by the senses. He gets that there's this dramatic difference. And so, well, look, if these things are so dramatically different, our ideas and what we perceive in the world around us, then, well, our ideas have to refer to something. They clearly can't refer to this world because this world is so diametrically different from it. Well, therefore, they have to refer to some other dimension, some higher spiritual world. And so, what Plato's really doing is he's grasping something important, which is that there has to be a mind, in effect. That there has to be a consciousness regarding things in a certain way in order to get at abstractions, but he's projecting that out into reality. And that is a understandable error. And I'm not saying it's a fully honest one, even on Plato's part, but you can really see the plausibility of it if you're thinking about it that way, and that it would be completely non-obvious, to say the least, for him to grasp this difference and then go, oh yeah, what we're doing is we're just omitting measurements of percepts. That is, there's no reason to regard that as the default view, to say the least. And so I think the wider lesson here is that these polemical views are clarifying and helpful, but they're clarifying, but we're getting them in kind of objectivism's essentialized form that's really meant to bring out their flaws. But that's not the form in which they're presented. They're presented as people really trying to get to the truth, or at least really trying to make it seem like they're trying to get to the truth. And so I think this is kind of a final perspective one should have on these ideas, but you need to get at, well, what are the arguments for them and why did people think that they were really plausible? And part of doing that then is to think, all right, where have I made similar errors? So precisely because these views are plausible, and precisely because Ayn Rand's view is so radical and different, it is very easy, I think, to, even for an objectivist, to fall into any of these polemical views. And so even something like the two worldview, even something like idealism, I think can really show up in your thinking. And you might think, well, how is that? Like, what objectivist is just going to go around and say, yeah, well, I accidentally tripped, fell, and ended up in a higher dimension. But if you think about actually, so what would be an example? There's when the whole like Black Lives Matter and anti-racism became a big thing, I had a lot of conversations with people who are at different institutions or jobs where really bad versions of this kind of anti-racist and really anti-enlightenment, anti-individualist views were being promoted, actively promoted in their organizations. And then the issue is, well, should I speak out? And people were really thinking and grappling with, well, what should I do? What should I speak out or not? And I'll say a little bit about what I think the right way to think about this is. And I'm not saying everybody who decided that, no, I shouldn't speak out was falling into a two worldview, but there are definitely elements of something that I would kind of summarize this way. Well, look, in a perfect world in Atlantis, of course, like the moral is the practical, and I need to speak out to defend my values. But in the world as it is, it's being so irrational. If I speak out, I'm going to be branded as a racist. I could lose this job. I could never find work again in my industry. And so that's who could tolerate. That would be a real sacrifice that I can't tolerate. And so, yeah, in Atlantis, that would be, something to do, but hey, you've got to be practical. Now, I'm not saying they put it exactly that way. I think that makes the air a little too glaring, but there's definitely this kind of view of, in effect, principles are good for, so if you think about the kind of Marxist view, right? They put the other world not in another dimension, but in this kind of vague future of, I think Ayn Rand has a line in Galt's speech about like, the world of your great grandchildren or something is when they promise you rewards. And there can be that kind of view, I think, in objectivism. It's like, yeah, in some indefinite future where people actually respect rationality, then the moral is the practical and I need to stand up for it. But in today's world as it is, being rational can destroy your values. So let me be clear on what I'm not saying. What I'm not saying is that, everybody who said, no, I can't speak up here was embracing a two worldview or rejecting the moral and the practical. And I certainly think that there's a real question of what does it mean to speak up when your values are attacked in a situation like this, and that there's a big difference between somebody who said, well, look, I talked to my supervisor and let him know what I think of this training or her think of this training, versus, oh, I went and wrote a Facebook post announcing my company and tried to start an insurrection at work. There can be a lot of questions about what speaking up for your values requires, but what I want to highlight is that you can see that there's ways in which a kind of two world view, which is, I think, in many ways the seeming like least plausible thing an objectivist can embrace, can show up in your own thinking. And so you need to be aware of it and on guard for it, and not view all of these polemical ideas, well, these are obviously wrong, and they're really just ways that, evil people try to put over their evil, versus that they can be plausible traps that even good people can fall into in more or less subtle ways. So that's it for this video, and that is it for Chapter 5 on Reason. We are going to dive in next time on Chapter on Man, and from here on out be in the kind of ethical and later political and aesthetic realm. So this has been the final point on epistemology, though as we'll see, objectivism's ethics is heavily epistemological. So we're going to be cashing in on a lot of the ideas that we've already talked about. And so until then, be sure to like this video and subscribe to the YouTube channel. And if you want to stay in contact, the best way is to go to donswriting.com and sign up for the newsletter. Talk next time.